This is Arise America.
Canada is introducing new laws that put a freeze on importing, buying or selling handguns. The regulations are expected to be enacted later this year. Canada already had plans to ban 1,500 types of military-style firearms and offer a mandatory buyback program that will begin at the end of the year. But Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says that the new measure comes after mass shootings in Uvalde, Texas and Buffalo.
Introducing legislation to implement a national freeze on handgun ownership. What this means is that it will no longer be possible to buy, sell, transfer, or import handguns anywhere in Canada. In other words, we're capping the market for handguns. We recognize that the vast majority of gun owners use them safely and in accordance with the law. But other than using firearms for sport shooting and hunting, there is no reason anyone in Canada should need guns in their everyday lives. And Canadians certainly don't need assault-style weapons that were designed to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time.
Well, let's bring in Arise International Correspondent Faith Orr, who's in New York. Faith, good to see you. Let's start with Uvalde. There's been a lot of activity recently. We've seen funerals take place. We've also seen a visit from President Biden over the weekend. Can you bring us up to date on what's been happening?
So we know that 11 funerals are planned for this week. One of the girls being laid to rest had just celebrated her 10th birthday. Now, she was actually given a new cell phone for her birthday, and she used that phone to try and call 911 to get police involved during the shooting. The police response, of course, remains under scrutiny. We know officers didn't confront the shooter, and it took more than an hour for him to be killed. Investigation into that is underway. Now, Uvalde only has about 15,000 residents and 2 funeral homes. So funeral directors from across Texas have offered help. Morticians are helping with facial reconstructions needed because of the damage caused to these children, because the killer used a military-style rifle. Now, the funerals will stretch into next week. The last one is scheduled for the 16th of June. We also saw the president visit the town over the weekend. Parents received some comfort there. He took one of the child's drawings back to the White House. It will now hang in the White House as a reminder of that tragedy.
Now, there was concerns following the attack last week of what they call the copycat attacks. Do we know anything that's come of that?
There have been at least 11 people arrested for making threats against schools since this attack happened. I'm just going to run you through a few. An 18-year-old man in Florida was detained after threatening on social media to carry out a mass school shooting. Similar social media threat was made by a 29-year-old man from Cape Cod. 4 teenagers were arrested in Texas for plotting to carry out another massacre like Uvalde. We saw a 16-year-old arrested in Long Island for threatening to shoot up his school, and a 14-year-old detained in Boulder for threatening a shooting at a middle school. Now, this comes on top of a fairly violent Memorial Day weekend. There were 14 mass shootings over the long weekend, but probably more stark, gun violence as a whole left at least 156 people dead and 412 people wounded over a weekend that is, of course, supposed to remember veterans who have died in the line of duty.
And New Zealand President Jacinda Ardern is currently visiting the US. She spent the past few days addressing the issue of gun violence, and she met with President Biden a little earlier. Do we know what the pair discussed?
Yes, so this is the first visit to the White House by a New Zealand leader since 2014. Of course, in that time, we have seen the Christchurch mass shooting happen in New Zealand, in which 51 people were killed. Now, New Zealand acted pretty quickly after that to put in place sweeping reform of its gun laws. Biden told Ardern that he needed her guidance on the issue. He wants to work with her, talk to her about what it was like enacting those laws. The pair discussed countering radicalization, both on and offline, and Jacinda Ardern shared her condolences on both shootings. She also, during her days in the US, has appeared on The Late Show, and she's spoken at a Harvard graduation ceremony where she explained that when New Zealand saw something like this happen, everyone just said, never again. And it was then on the politicians to respond to that. Now, just to put it all in context, there were 3 times as many people killed just over the weekend here in the US than died in New Zealand's worst ever mass shooting.
Just before we move on to another issue, I mean, the thing is, it's quite difficult to compare really in terms of culture, because we've seen New Zealand, and last week we talked about Dunblane in the UK, how the government's relatively quickly brought in new regulations, whereas in the US, the Second Amendment, it's their culture, and it's not a simple case of get the politicians to vote, because as we've seen over the weekend at the NRA conference, there are so many people that are adamant that they must have guns.
Indeed, and Ardern actually addressed that. She said herself that the political situation in New Zealand is entirely different to the political situation here in the US, and that it was much easier for them because there was also the public will as well as the political will. I mean, a little earlier we heard from a Louisiana senator asked why people should have assault rifles, and his answer was because, well, people are hunting feral pigs. And when you have that sort of attitude from lawmakers that, you know, they think that the right to have a gun to hunt a feral pig is more important than a children's safety, then it's very, very difficult to pass these laws, because that is what it comes down to, is not just the gun lobby, which of course, as we know, is very powerful. You know, the NRA held their event, people showed up to support that. But even sort of common sense laws of background checks, people strike that down. And that's because there is the Second Amendment. But of course, critics say that when that Second Amendment was put in place, the people who put it in place, founding fathers of America, didn't envisage an 18-year-old being able to buy a military-style weapon and walk into a school and shoot people. You know, it was put in place because America hadn't long gained its independence from Britain, and it was, you know, it was to protect individuals. But, you know, they had muskets, they didn't have AR-15. So things have changed a lot since the Second Amendment was written.
Now, we know President Biden and Jacinda Ardern also talked about trade. What was the latest on that?
So Ardern are undoubtedly concerned about Washington's involvement, or indeed lack thereof, in the Indo-Pacific region. While she's in DC, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been visiting a number of Pacific nations to discuss economic and security agreements. China very much trying to grow its influence in the region. Now, Ardern is encouraging Biden to strengthen ties there. Of course, we did see him make his 5-day visit to Asia recently. He went to South Korea, he went to Japan to try and combat China's rising power. Ardern is keen to get Biden to sign the US back up to the comprehensive and progressive agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, that is a replacement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump pulled the US out of back in 2017. Now, he said he pulled the US out because he wanted to protect American jobs and wages. But despite pledging to boost trade ties in the region, Biden has not yet signed up to the New Deal. He has signed up to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. Now, that sets out common standards in trade and clean energy, but it doesn't ease tariffs in the way that the other deal was. And he won't sign up to that because there's opposition in Congress and there's concerns it could lead to US jobs being shipped overseas. The two leaders, in their time in the Oval Office, they also discussed the climate crisis and the war in Ukraine. Biden did thank Ardern for her support in that respect in the war in Ukraine, but very much regional issues as well as gun violence, radicalisation on the agenda for these two.
And quickly before you go, Faith, overall, how has Jacinda Ardern's visit to the US been perceived? What's the reaction been like?
You know, the reaction in the US hasn't been particularly overwhelming, but her comments have really shone in New Zealand. I have to say, I was speaking to some of my colleagues from New Zealand just a few days ago, and, you know, TV there, all the newspapers, they are following this step by step, because it's really, you know, it's her moment in the spotlight on the international stage, which is quite interesting. In the US itself, I mean, her comments in The Late Show certainly gained some traction, as well as at Harvard. But in the US frame of things, you know, New Zealand, a reasonably small nation, although important in the Indo-Pacific region for America, but not an overwhelmingly huge partner for them. But it's interesting, in home media, that is where this trip is really in the spotlight, and people are really saying this is her moment to shine on the international stage.
It's a rare opportunity since COVID. It's been she's hasn't ventured out much, but thank you very much indeed for your analysis. We'll have to leave it there. Faith Orr, Arise international correspondent in New York.
This is Arise America.